We want to thank you for joining us, downloading this podcast. And this is MASTERCLASS After Hours. We have just had a wonderful opportunity to spend an hour with Paul Stevens, who has spent much of his life work in helping the church understand how to take their faith to the workplace. And not only the priority of the church, but also recognizing that the kingdom of God is lived out not only when the church gathers, but when the church is scattered as well. And so we're really excited to continue this podcast with Paul Stevens. We're joined today with Michael Waddell, Neville Gosman, and Greg Jones. And so I'm going to ask you guys to unmic and just kind of welcome to the conversation. So to begin, Paul, just thank you for taking the time to be with us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. It's a very special privilege for me to visit with pastors.
Yeah, thanks for that. So what we want to do is just, I'm asking the question first round, and we'll just kind of go around and give each of you the opportunity to ask a question of Paul or to talk about some of the content. So what did you hear today that Paul shared that might have been new to you? Or what have you read in his readings that kind of might have been new to you when you first heard it and you went, I'd like to know a little bit more about that? And Neville, I'm wondering if we can start with you.
Well, the marketplace has always been of great interest to me because I never ever did see the dichotomy that was often a part of that, simply because my dad worked at CBC and was always integrating his faith in that very secular place, but never ever saw what he did in church and what he did at his work or on the sports field as something that was a trichotomy. You know, you press the spiritual button. And so it was never an enemy place. It was never a foreign place. Evangelism was meant to be done there just as much as it was to be done, you know, through the arm of the traditional church. I guess what I heard was just a return to a very biblical message. We see the writers of the New Testament engaging in, you know, what has become the overarching statement of tent making, so as to enter in. Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 9 in particular, never ever wanted to make use of his right as an apostle, and so had the skill of marketplace as a tent maker and, you know, his sense of call, and combined those to benefit the kingdom.
Yeah, Neville, I really appreciate your comments about your dad too, because my dad was eventually became the president of a steel fabrication company. And I worked in that company in the punch press and warehouse and tool room and everything except becoming president. But, you know, and my dad was a wonderful Christian person. And, but he never heard that what he was doing was the Lord's work. And he never saw the significance of what he was doing. In fact, he said things like, you know, if I had to do it over again, he said, I think I'd become a pastor because, you know, that work really counts. It's going to count for eternity and so on. And I'm sorry that, you know, he died before I really had a chance to minister to him, that he was already in ministry. And he was a terrific person. He was a terrific president. In fact, of course, he died many, many years ago, but recently we ran into the caretaker from the building. And when he heard, you know, who my dad was, he said, Mr. Stevens, you know, he always treated me with respect, and I respected his faith. And, you know, people get to know that you believe that you have an orientation in your life.
Mhm.
And I think that raises questions, which is terrific.
Yeah, thanks for that. Michael, what about for you? I know that you've been walking along with Paul for the last little while with your work with Canadian Baptist Ministries, but what caught you today and kind of went, oh, I want to know a little more about that?
Yeah, that's a good question for sure. There's so much in that last hour that I could dig into. I think my head right now is in sort of maybe picking up from a little bit of what Neville has just raised. But if you look at current data, there's a lot of talk about how particularly the millennial generation and younger are really craving, really seeking meaningful work. Paul, I've heard you say, and I've read you, and I don't know if it's your original to you or you're quoting somebody, I can't remember, but meaning is the new money. And so Daniel Pink, okay. So I'm thinking about in the masterclass that you just did, you made a statement. You said it's not the religious nature of the work that makes it last. I think it was something to that effect. And then you said, but rather work done in faith, hope, and love. And so I guess I'm just sort of thinking around, what does that really mean? Like how could we help people of all ages, but in particular the younger generation that is really looking for meaning? Can you talk more about that faith, hope, and love? I mean, we all know the passage in 1 Corinthians, but then there's the 1 Thessalonians passage, which I think you're probably referencing as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. And the book of Ecclesiastes is really very, very interesting because he kind of comes out with a double message. He says, if you find joy in your work, meaning in it, just thank God and seize it, But he says, by and large, and he's researching life and particularly work, but he's researching life under the sun, which is without any reference to a supernatural, transcendent God. Okay. And he comes to the conclusion, life is just a puff of smoke. It's just, but the fact is, in the end, he says, I'll tell you where meaning is found. It's found in the fear of God, which is affectionate reverence to God. So, one of the strange things that I sometimes say is that we don't find meaning in our work so much as we bring meaning to our work. And I think that meaning that we've brought to our work comes from the Lord, actually, as he informs us that we're doing his work. B, it is a significant way of loving our neighbor, loving our brother and our sister. It's a neighbor love thing. And further, that some of our work is even going to last and take its place in the new heaven and new earth. And I don't know which of my works, are really going to last, but I think I've got an inkling of some that I think will last. And so, the old saying, only one life will soon be past, only what's done for Christ will last. But it's profoundly true that when we do work for the Lord, we have lasting work. And it's not the religious character of that work that is, the fact that I've preached a lot of sermons, and it's been an enormous privilege to do it. I don't know, which of these sermons are going to last. But I do know that some of the things that I've made with my hands and my mind, I think are going to last. So meaning is not something we dredge out of a job. It's something we bring to it.
Well, that's helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Greg, let's bring you in on the conversation. And what are you thinking about right now?
Oh, many things. Thank you. I appreciate being here. And as I said to Paul, and, I think because I've already alluded with Paul that I was a Regent student back in the early 80s. And in some ways, sometimes I've always struggled to understand why kind of the things you're talking about hasn't been more innate within our church. And I'll come around to that. But I think your influence in my life in my early years, even at a distance, but Lauren and Mary Ruth Wilkinson, I was just sitting here thinking Ward Gask, in a sense, Dal Sindel. These are names I know, and these were people that some of them I was close to and their thinking, and then all the others who were a part of that, both at Regent and in those years down at Carey. And then, so I sometimes think, like, why isn't this more innate? So we right now are launching an initiative called Mission Edge, and I'm not looking to get a plug in, but I want to set up the question this way a bit. So, we've just defined Mission Edge churches. What we're calling our churches to be, the definitions, communities of Jesus followers. I always say this is a definition I think applies to every church through 2,000 years of history. Communities of Jesus followers who align around his continuing mission of sacrificial love, starting right in their neighborhoods, and from there reaching into neighborhoods around the world. So we like a definition that no churches say, well, that's not us. And then we say, well, really, then there's 6 kind of things, kind of like the fruit of the Spirit, 6 markers we would see. One of which, and I've wanted to start with this, and I think it's my Regent roots and my understanding, but we call it living the Jesus way, both gathered and scattered, wherever we are. And then the other 5 that flow out of that, and it applies in all of our life, both as we gather and scatter: radiating hospitality, fluency in the good news, embodying the good news, embracing partnerships, and contextually responsive. So if you think of those, and there's no exam, no one's going to get that many that fast, but I'm just kind of setting it up. But, I remember talking to a lady one time, and I was talking about, how ministry in the workplace or how we serve. And she said, but you don't understand. I can't talk about Jesus where I am. And I know this kind of goes back to what Mike was just asking you about. And we're not just talking about faith in the marketplace. We're just trying to say it's that 24/7 living the kingdom wherever God has us. But my question is, what happened? How did we come up with such a dualistic notion that faith was what happened in the church, and somehow we didn't know what to do with those other 6 24-hour days? And it's such a challenge for us to think of what that means to be people of the kingdom out there in everyday life.
Well, I really appreciate your definition of mission, and think it's beautiful. But your question's a haunting one, which is, why is it not innate in the church that we can think of and live out the truth that we're serving God full-time. All of us are full-time in ministry, full-time, even when we're sleeping. So, that's a haunting question. And I've tried to really do some research on that. And I think that the Greek world, which was like a fog surrounding the early church, Greek culture, is a factor. It's not the only factor, but it's a factor in that the body was an evil shell of a precious immortal soul. And salvation was to get the soul out of the body, which happened when you died. And even today, when we talk about flesh and spirit, people think about the body and the spirit. But flesh doesn't mean that in Paul's literature. Flesh is living as though Christ had not come, died, and been resurrected. kata sarx as compared with kata pneuma. So that's one influence. I think another influence is the structure of life in the Roman Empire, and to a very large extent in Asia today, which is hierarchical. So, and then a third influence, the hierarchy being clergy and laity. And, I kind of teasingly teach that the church has no lay people in the usual sense of that word, which means untrained, unordained, because we are ordained, all of us, through our baptism, actually. And yet is full of clergy in the real meaning of that word, which means blessed and commissioned. And the word kleros in Greek is used for the whole people of God, not for pastors. So when we walk into the church today, we find there's two kinds of people. There's clergy and there's laity. And, I was ordained in Temple Baptist Church in Montreal. And of course, one of the things that you do in an ordination service, you got to give your call to the ministry. And I said, I'm called to ministry. I know I am. But I don't have a call to be a professional minister all my life. I said, I believe the call to minister in a particular local church comes not directly from God, but from the people. And I said, prophetically, part of my life, I may be working in the world. And the clergy hated it. The laity loved it. And the ordination council passed me on a 51% vote. I got ordained, which is not what you call. And then, there's the transformation, the transposition of the Old Testament clergy and laity. And there really is, under the older covenant, something quasi close to the idea of clergy and laity. The priests were. But hey, under the new covenant, we're all priests. It's the priesthood of all believers, which is the watchword of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. And so, if we use the Old Testament as our guide in this matter, we're going to, and then, I don't want to be a seminary basher. I really don't. I owe so much to my own seminary education. I owe so much to it. But the fact is that it's professional enculturation. And I think every seminary should really have, if possible, an equal number of people that are not going to be pastors, that are trying to integrate their faith with their whole life. And in fact, that's mostly why people go to seminary today, is not to become professionalized, but rather to find their faith and to integrate that faith with their life. I think it's happening. So, there are a number of sources of this dualism, but I think it's the most pernicious heresy of the church today.
Paul, thank you for that. That's I don't know about for Neville and Michael and Greg, but that's just got my head spinning in really trying to understand how we've arrived at where we're at. And I really appreciate that, because I think that brings some clarity as to how that has occurred in the life of the church, at least here in our experience in Canada. So thanks for that. Does anybody have a follow-up question for Paul on that?
I think that even if we didn't have the truths of history behind us, the fact that we live in what some might call a creator economy, a production economy during the Industrial Revolution, baby boomers, and the consumer economy. When I spend time with students, 20-year-olds, I've had a privilege of doing that. There are things that they want to do. Even my own children, who are all in their 20s, they did the professional degree, and 3 out of the 4 have already switched careers and started businesses on their own. And this is just like a natural development of their own Christian discipleship. There's something about creating something that is connected to their faith that I've never ever seen before. And there's a need for us to understand a theology of those kinds of changes. We often would say, we're going to change careers. And maybe in my day it began, and certainly in my father's day, he had 2 jobs. One was 30 years at CBC and the other one 17 years, in ministry. But there's a shift that has taken place that necessitates a theology of creativity in ways that I've never seen. But I see it as a discipleship tool, even in my own kids' lives.
Oh, thank you, Neville. I think it's happening in general society. Daniel Pink, in his Whole New Mind, his book, says we've moved from the information society to the creativity society, and I think that is. But most of the world's not there, eh? Most of the world is. At least half the world is surviving. But nevertheless, the privileged part of the world is definitely embracing a creativity society. Okay. But I think particularly for believers, because, we're in touch with the Creator and He inspires us. The will of God is not what it is in Islam, which is an overpowering, overwhelming control. But it's an inspiring, empowering vision of greatness under God, like the dream that God gave Joseph as a teenager, a late teenager, which inspires us. And I think, and I sometimes say this, that I think Christians should be the most creative people on earth, because we're in touch with the source of creativity, new ideas. And I just love the story of Bezalel in Exodus 31, 35, because, he was a craftsman, but he's the only person of whom it was said in the Old Testament that he was filled with the Holy Spirit. And he was filled with the Holy Spirit to create beautiful things. And that can be in a voice or an invoice or a meal or a deal or anything. But still. And, there's a United Church of Canada clergy person who wrote a book in 1930, before the Second World War, called The Social Achievements of the Christian Church. It's a wonderful book, E.H. Oliver. And when people say the church has never done the world any good, man, they just give them a copy of this book, because he tells the stories of every century up to 1930. And there's lots of great things that have happened since 1930. But one of the key things that he says is, the church has done its best work in history as a pioneer rather than an ambulance.
Yeah.
And we've been an ambulance. We have. We cared for the weak and the sick and the lonely and the captive and the prisoner, and which is great, But he said we've done our best work in invention, in pioneering things. And it's a beautiful book. Been reprinted by Regent College, actually.
There's a similar book by a Jewish rabbi on the history of all the Nobel Prize winners in all their various divisions.
Oh, okay.
And it shows that those from a Christian paradigm make up 65% of all Nobel laureates. And then from the small Jewish population, you add like another something like 18%, and it leaves all the other secular thinking and all the other religions at just a teeny tiny little fraction. It's like 88% from a Judeo-Christian point of view. And you can find that book. You just type in Nobel laureates, even in Wikipedia.
Yeah.
And it's there, and the name of the book. And I think it's the third installment that this Jewish scholar came out with.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
And that's all original thinking.
Paul, just as you're talking there, it reminds me, the level of creativity and how that is really being identified within the Christian emerging community. And I think about Haddon Robinson used to say that we've given over both the publishing world and the cinema world, and that we need to take it back. And he just had encouraged us in classes to become a new generation of poets and of screenwriters, and just kind of being able to capture that creativity and to be able to share the big message of the kingdom of God in that visual, artistic way. And so it's fascinating. Yeah. Michael, what else have you heard that you kind of go, oh, that's just gold. That just helps so much?
Yeah, I think my mind is going to the space, like what draws me to my work and what fuels me. Like I'm a former business owner, but trained theologically for ministry, vocational ministry, professional ministry, I guess, to use the words right. And, I often think about how in my past, like you think about discipleship. I'm thinking about Greg's definition not definition, but the point number 1 about living the Jesus way. I forget how you said it, every day of the week or through everything. I often think about, I often think about how in my past, when I think about my own formation, it was like, okay, I need to be having a daily quiet time, reading, prayer, that type of study. I need to be involved in, Bible study at midweek at the church, or involved in a small group. I need to be at Sunday morning worship, and all those things are good and right. I'm not saying that. But when I thought about your quote from Eugene Peterson about the workplace being the primary place for spiritual formation or spiritual growth, and I think how much that's not emphasized, right? Like in our Christian faith or in our churches today, we're calling out of the workplace, come be discipled here, when really that quote says, no, it can happen out there. The formation can happen out there. And I don't know if there's just more you can say to that. I'm just really intrigued by that thought, because what my heart for the work that I do with Canadian Baptist Ministries isn't really about business and work. It's actually about that element of whole life discipleship, about drawing people into everyday walk with Jesus. And so the thought that, the 87,000 hours or whatever it is they say that the average person spends working, the thought that they can actually be formed into the likeness of Christ more fully through those hours and through that work is just really intriguing to me.
Yeah. Have you got an hour? But no, seriously, I've really, really thought a lot about this. And I think that, first of all, work is itself a spiritual discipline. Work is a spiritual discipline. And I think it's through work that we actually grow spiritually. Let me try a thought question. let's say you won the lottery or you had an inheritance so massive that you could just quit work and never have to work again, ever. Would that be good for you spiritually? I think it'd be terrible. William Perkins, the Puritan, English Puritan, he said that those people that live on landed estates, that don't have to work, he says, they're damned. Well, I don't think I wouldn't want to say they're damned. But anyway, through work, when I became the academic dean of Regent College, the president, Dr. Walter Wright, said to me, in this job, you're going to have to deal with yourself. He said, you like to teach, you get a good feedback from students, but he said, you're not going to get any positive feedback. He said, most deans are hated. And they are. I wasn't hated, but I wasn't liked. And he said, you have to deal with yourself. He said, you have an inclination to go and to do what brings you positive feedback. Praise, if you like, the praise of men. And then he said something beautiful. He says, and I will help you. And he did. Every Thursday morning we had breakfast together. He mentored me. But, I grew. Not that I've, achieved sainthood. But secondly, it's not only through work, but it's before and after work that we can prepare for work. The Mary and Martha story is very brilliant. And Haddon Robinson, whom Garth just mentioned, really cracked it open for me. He really did. And, a Roman Catholic priest in Manila, his name is Thomas Green, said, every Christian, even in a cloistered community, has a hyphenated name, Mary-Martha. We need both the active and the reflective life. But thirdly, there are actually disciplines we can undertake while we're working without becoming inefficient or distracted. And we are a distracted generation. Cell phones, smartphones are one of the chief ways that we get constantly distracted. But I think there are things we can do while we're working. One is prayer. The first little book that I was given when I became a Christian was Brother Lawrence's The Practice of the Presence of God. He was a chef in a monastery kitchen. Brothers were upstairs praying. He was downstairs working. And they would come down, they'd say, Lawrence, we don't understand how you know God so well. And you're working and we're praying. And he said, I just go to God through everything I do. My time of work is not different from my time of devotion. So prayer and then hospitality. We're creating a space in our hearts for people where they can be free. And even meditation. You can actually undertake meditation on, maybe during the coffee break, lunch hour, but maybe even just when you've finished a task, or you're starting a task, or you're struggling with something, but hey, you can actually meditate. So there are things we can do without becoming distracted or inefficient. And in fact, I don't know whether it's a true story or a legend about St. Augustine, but St. Augustine was accused by Christians because he bought his sandals from non-Christian sandal makers. And his answer is terrible. He said, I do too much walking to walk on inferior sandals that the Christians make. I thought, oh man, it's terrible because Christians don't get into their work. Many times, at least, they don't. And Paul said that to the slaves in Colossae in Colossians 3. He said, put your heart into it, get into it. It's the Lord Christ you're serving. So, yeah, there's lots of things that you can do and be.
Wow. Greg, any thoughts or questions that you want to kind of?
Well, we're dancing all around this, and I'd like to ask Paul, because I'm always intrigued when people ask, they'll reach out and they'll say, do you have any great discipleship resources, or what's the best model for discipling? And I always want to say, what do you mean by discipling? What's your vision of discipling? And Paul, I think you're a good one to ask that too. I think we're dancing around this, but when you were a pastor in local churches, or when people talk about discipling, what do you think that is to entail or look like? Or what's our goal in discipleship? Any thoughts? I think I'd like to just hear you on that.
Well, first of all, whole life discipleship is really what the New Testament teaches. Whole life discipleship. And even in the Great Commission, teaching them to observe everything that I've said to you. And it includes work, it includes sexuality, it includes money, it includes stewardship of time, it includes all kinds of relationships, and it includes our relationship with the people of God. Yeah, but whole life discipleship is really what I think Jesus wants. Now, how we do that as pastors is really a challenge, because, I've read all the books on disciple-making pastor and disciple-making church and so on. And, how many people can you disciple? I mean, you can't disciple a crowd. I meet every Thursday afternoon from 4:30 to 5:30 with the CEO of Denim Jeans. And he's based in Shanghai. He's been quarantined for 40 days in Shanghai. And no sign of being able to get out of the house yet. But we cover everything, we cover his work, his relationship, his church. He's planted 2 cafe churches in Shanghai, 40 members max. Okay. Secret police know all about it. They just say you're doing good, more good for the country than harm, and just don't get big. And so, he doesn't allow those churches to become more than 40 before he starts another one. So, but it's whole life discipleship. And I think that you do have an opportunity to disciple whole life discipleship as a pastor through your teaching, through your nurturing the environment, the community, the culture of your local church, through the way in which you spend your time. And I think you can actually, and I've always done this, and I know it's controversial, I've actually concentrated on less than a dozen people in as a pastor. Mm-hmm. And, there's a British author called Thornton. He said, Jesus spent 2/3 of his time with 12 Hebrews because this was the only way he could save all the North Americans. I put the word North in front of what it was, but it's a bit of British slander. But still, when you think of it, Jesus did teach the crowd, but he spent most of his time, 12 people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Neville, I'm going to give you the last question, and this has been great. We could probably go for hours, I think, in listening to Paul talk on this subject. But Neville, maybe I'll turn it over to you for maybe one last question.
And it has implications with Mike also, because I remember reading one of his newsletters, and he's doing business overseas. And then I'm thinking about, and this was the question that I put in the chat: where should our education and the starting point be in training to be truly harvest soul winners, and how to make a kingdom impact? Where's the starting point? And I'm thinking, the Waddells, they raise all these funds, they go overseas, they do business in order to do kingdom work. And then I'm not sure now, Mike, if you're coming over here, continuing that business, but all of a sudden we have to stop that and do regular pastoral things. I guess my question is, we'll spend 7 years in seminary education and never ever take a business course, and maybe we might get a leadership course. What's the future of education going to look like in light of what the shift that's taking place? That seems to be more than just a shift, as much as it's a kingdom correction.
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, I think I want to say the best seminary in the world is the local church. There's no better context in which people can be discipled and empowered and prepared for ministry. Local church. Yeah. Now, that's not to say there isn't a place for seminary education. I think there really is. Of course there is. But with regard to seminary education, I think that we have got to devise ways of getting out of the classroom. So basically, I had a course which I taught many, many years, called the Traveling Marketplace Seminars. I took people to Eastern Europe when the wall came down. I took people into businesses and into professional offices, into factories and into farms. And they found out how these businesses ran, and they interviewed, obviously, all but one was a Christian. And that one who wasn't a Christian, he had something to say, but how they integrate their faith with their work, well, it's transformative. I mean, we had students saying, in all my 3 years at Regent, nothing has transformed me more than that immersion. And so I think there are things we can do in education to get people out of the classroom, get them off of Zoom, and to get them into real life situations. But I return to the point I made at the very beginning, which is, hey, the church, the local church, is the best context in which we can empower people for ministry and life, if we do it right. And I was sitting in the research library of McMaster, translating the Greek of Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. And you know what it's going to say. Pastor teachers are called to equip the saints for the work of ministry. The King James Version had a fatal comma, to equip the saints, comma, to do the work of ministry, comma, and to build up the body of Christ. There's no comma in the Greek. And it was a bolt of lightning for me. I said, if I ever become a pastor, I should be judged not by how well I preach or how well I do pastoral care, but whether I'm using whatever gifts, talents that I have to actually empower and equip others for ministry. And that ministry is primarily in the world, but it's also in the church. Okay. So you guys are really on the front lines.
Paul, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to just engage with us a little bit deeper in this podcast following your teaching. I'm really excited to see what you and Michael are going to get up to with as you partner with CBM in the Faith Plus work new direction. And so we look forward to hearing more in the future on that. So I want to thank you, Michael, Neville, and Greg for joining us as well. But Paul, you've given us a great gift of time, and we're really thankful for that.